Hi, and welcome to the breakdown. My name is Cody Atkinson.
G'day, I'm Sean Lawson. And we've got the second last week of actual football to look at, third last week of the season, but of course there's that very important quarantine break in there.
And we had a great round of football last week, didn't we, Sean?
Yeah, we did. Geelong finally showed something and looked pretty imperious towards the end, overpowering GWS.
And
And
that
of course, we
barn
had
burner. Yeah.
that thriller, that second consecutive week with a 1-point win.
And look, we saw GWS come out a bit flat after that huge win with some injuries, and the Dogs are going to be carrying some injuries this week against Port. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. We're going to do a bit of a breakdown for the final four, the second and third last games of football, respectively. So what we've done this week for the ABC, and we're going to pull this up at the start, not the end this week, and Sean's going to be driving the screen action this week. Is we had a look at some of the key factors in play for Melbourne, Geelong, Port, and the Dogs. We're not going to go over them much more. We're going to chuck a link in the YouTube comments, and if I get it on any other streaming services, we can do that. But look, we started with part of the enduring appeal of footy is that no two seasons are the same. At the start of the year, you expect that Richmond would have made the final four. They didn't even make the finals. Brisbane were at this stage last year, and they've been knocked out. We've got two returners and two new sides. And do you think that's due to the equalisation stuff, the way we see a more even AFL, Sean?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, most years you do see teams shuffle in and out of both the top four and the top eight. But if you look over any sort of decent time span, most teams do make a prelim probably at least every decade. So it's a good degree of churn to keep people's hopes up.
Yeah, and it's good because we've got only one of these teams have won a flag really in the last decade. Geelong was 2011. And we've got the Dogs in 2016, which was a bit of a surprise flag. But the other two teams really have been waiting a while for Melbourne. It's been a very, very long while. And
What's that streak?
Might get to that a bit later. It's 57 years. So the piece and Sean's just going to scroll through it in the background. We looked at the strong points, which are, Sean, Geelong's forward line versus Melbourne's defence.
And Melbourne's pressure, Melbourne's pressure, Geelong's control.
Yeah, and we're not going to bore you too much with it. And the second half of the article is about the merits of a team who start hard versus a team that closes hard. And it's got a lot of visuals, a lot of graphs, a lot of GIFs. Highly recommended read, but we're not going to go over that today. I know. So, Sean, do you want to look at who's favoured by the models?
Yeah, there's not too many surprises here. The two winning qualifying finalists, the two high-ranked teams, Port and Melbourne, they're both looking reasonably close but clear favourites. Given it's a prelim, it's the best teams that are left. For both models, games to be modelling out over 60% to one team is a reasonably clear staking of the flag for the mathematical contingent.
Yeah, and if you have a look at the models themselves, there's a couple that are tipping almost a draw for Geelong. Geelong's actually come in quite a lot in the last little bit, whereas I don't think the changes have helped the Bulldogs. No. I think Port are considered, especially because of the home ground advantage that Port will actually be able to have. Port's considered a pretty strong favourite here. I'm of the mind that home ground advantage doesn't matter as much when it comes to finals. But Sean, do you have a different view?
It's really hard to draw any conclusions from specific finals matches, but I think more than once we've seen relatively inexperienced teams in particular be just overawed and just melt on a big stage in front of a large hostile crowd. I think you may have attended a certain grand final that looked like that a few years ago.
I just a couple of years ago, I was there at the
when you could very much see the head drops after the things go against them, the wall of affirmation comes up. I think while it's probably not every time, there's certainly the possibility for that to get into players' heads on the big day.
That grand final is really interesting, and I don't want to waste all the video time on this, but the Giants actually looked good for the first quarter. They did look totally overawed. It was the rest of the game, and it was really, it was one or two moments.
You could just see them deflate.
Yeah, and the crowd just.
So that can happen. Yeah, that can happen.
And there were Richmond fans everywhere, so they were feeling really flat really early. And as the Tigers started to get ascendancy, they really started to go a bit wild. So what we're going to do is a bit like previous weeks here. Sean's going to drive our advanced stats dashboard, and we will put a link in it to the YouTube comments here and whatever. This is all courtesy of Richard Little's or a Little Fitness on Twitter's fantastic scraping of this data. And we've just chucked it into Tableau Public. And it's just a good little dashboard. It's not 100% perfect. There's some games missing. There's some categorization. But if you can live with that, it's a pretty good sign. We're going to start with the first game of the round, Geelong versus Melbourne. Well, should we say Melbourne versus Geelong, Sean? Because,
I think we should. It's Melbourne's pretend home ground.
And to
be honest, they'll probably have the neutrals.
They will. And I think they've done a very good job at utilising that, because I think they're not going to get many home finals. Well, they haven't had many home finals for a fair crack of time. And this is
they managed to get the 1 year when they won't get to have the grand final on their deck.
Yeah, absolutely. So Melbourne's strength here is in their defence, right? So we're just looking at chain points a game here from stoppage clearances. And you might ask why stoppage clearances. So it's not the major source of score, but it is a major source of score. Stoppage clearances are pretty vital for momentum-wise, wouldn't you say, Sean?
Yeah, definitely. Because they tend to be the way you can break out of a period of congestion or a period of struggle. The ball's locked in for a little bit. You have stoppage after stoppage. Being able to break that open, find a mark, find a goal, or find a snap directly on goal, or a chain out of the most neutral of situations, it's a really good way to open the game back up, reset the positions, go back to first principles at the centre bounce.
And let's have a look at centre clearances there too, Sean, if you don't mind clicking across there.
This is defensive centre clearances. Geelong and Melbourne are the two best teams at not be conceding from centre clearances. Barely a goal a game against each of them. And
you look at North and Adelaide at the top. A goal a game doesn't sound much, but that's nearly half of what the best team, the worst teams are giving up. And it's really quite impressive from a defensive point of view. We're not going to see many scores, you'd think, from centre clearances. Can we just pull up intercept marks here for a second too?
Yes, we can. Also score chain points. Yep.
Chain points is fantastic from intercept marks. Melbourne are very good at structuring up after they give up the ball. If they don't go as short and direct up forward, sometimes they'll bomb it deep because they generally have 3 to 4 tall targets. When they give it up, they know what they have to do. They need to try to lock it in. And that's demonstrated in the chain points per game. It's just ridiculous.
They don't mind getting it in quickly and riskily because it's not usually coming back the other way against them. And they do have good presence from some of their other guys there, like Fritsch and Pickett and so forth.
Pickett's been fantastic this year. There's
a good risk balance for the long bomb into the forward 50 for Melbourne, which is a good thing because they've been doing it for years.
And they nearly always have a nigh-on goalkeeper at the back. They'll have a Lever or a May or even a Salem dropping deep back to stop those super fast break goals. It's not all teams do that.
And if you're lucky enough to watch them live, you can really watch the way they zone off each other and maximize the amount of space they cover by keeping 20, 30, 40 meters away from each other and switching up whether they're laterally either side of each other or one going back and one going towards the ball, depending on the situation. They're very well in sync for guys who I don't think actually played together that much before this year because of absences.
And that's the thing, right? A lot of people are taken by why has Melbourne come out of nowhere? They had that prelim, 3 years ago now, but they sort of did rise a bit out of nowhere this year. 2018 to now, they really didn't do much. They didn't make the finals in the middle. Last year, they were hit really hard by injuries. 2019, they were hit really hard by injuries. May and Lever have been there for a fair chunk now. Salem's been there.
Might have been going down some tactical blind alleys as well in that period, particularly with the faith in certain smaller defenders and a few other things.
Yeah, and we did talk about in the piece, and if they do win this game, we're going to talk about in the grand final preview, certainly the focus on the forward 50 trapping and having enough defensive small forwards and better forward entries that players can play a couple of different roles rather than just being unitaskers. And I think that's good. Can we just quickly look at the rebound 50 scores too here?
Yeah, I think it's a similar picture to the intercept marks one.
I think you've just gone to running bounce.
Oh, that's a fun one.
Fun, but a little bit
Yeah.
useless. And that's the best thing, right? So when they've turned it up over in their inside 50, other teams can't transition out effectively.
Yeah.
That's just a
another thing.
killer.
Can we find that Fremantle direct score from a rebound 50 at some point?
We'll try to pull that up for you, Sean. So really what we're talking about here is Melbourne are killers when at stoppages. They're really killers when we go to intercept marks. And if you just go to the teams tab there and make sure you stretch it to all 25 rounds. There we go.
Yeah. And we're looking for...
Let's go to intercept marks. Or either one, yeah. And if you sort by chain points per game,
yeah,
Melbourne's at the top.
Heaps.
They're really good at turning turnover ball into actual scores. They're really good at turning stoppage clearances into scores. Not only that, they're really good at stopping the other team from doing the same.
Geelong a bottom 6 team for scoring out of intercept marks. Despite their very good defence, they're not using that defence offensively very much.
That's as good a transition as I'll ever hear, because Sean, most teams score more often from intercepts, right? That's just how they score. Last week we saw an absolute clinic from, and we were just looking at rebounds there. Yeah, look, they're not really doing much from rebound either. They're really at the bottom of that crew, except for the Dogs. We'll get to them later. Last week, Geelong made their running via the stoppage clearances. So could we pull up last week's stoppage clearances, Sean?
Yep.
It was quite ridiculous. So year-long average, they're top 2, right? They get about 20 points a game from stoppage clearances. That's great. 22.
They got almost 7 goals. So what? That would be about 6 goals 4, wouldn't it?
That's insane. That's almost unheard of.
7 goals 3.
And you actually get a bit worried when they score that much, don't you, Sean?
You got to think they're not going to be able to do that against Melbourne's midfield.
With
the guys Melbourne have in there, with their record of stoppage clearances themselves, with Gawn dictating play, it's going to be really hard. Even if they do get a bit of a run on, all they'll need to do is get to Gawn at the next break, get a runner out there, tell him to start dropping it at the feet, crowd it up, and that will dry up for Geelong if they do manage to get that going.
Can we look at what they've done against Melbourne on the year in stoppage clearances? If you just go to pull out all the rounds there again and pick Melbourne as the opposition team.
Yep. It's a nice little showcase. Yes, Melbourne. So they were kind of okay here. Geelong were middle of the pack in terms of actually scoring against Melbourne from stoppage clearance. But as you can see, not many teams are doing it a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So if Geelong have to rely on their ability to score from stoppages, they're going to be in trouble, I suspect. That was what got them out of jail last week, but I don't think it will get them out of jail next week. Could we quickly have a look at the forward 50 marks too? We'll start with against Melbourne, but then we'll
same game. Yep.
Yeah, so they played twice this year and Melbourne did win both, but the second one was a bit fishy, I want to say, because Geelong really pulled their midfield rotations a bit funkily. When I say funkily, they really were playing second and third rotation mids for most of that second half of that second game after they had the game in control. Chris Scott actually said something really interesting after the game. He said Melbourne quite clearly wanted it more, and or words to those effect, which is always fun on the eve of finals, isn't it, Sean?
Yeah, we expect them to be a fairly torrid and desperate affairs. Like, if you don't win, you don't have to front up next week.
It was a game we deserved to lose. We wanted to lose. No one's ever said that, except for maybe a couple of times in Melbourne's tanking past or Richmond's tanking past. But apparently Geelong were quite content to lose that one.
Yeah.
So anyway, they averaged 28 per game against Melbourne. Could we have a look at them on the year there, if we are just add all opposition teams?
Yeah,
so the picture is
usually.
Yeah, they usually get 46.
Forward 50 marks.
So Melbourne's
really good.
Melbourne halved that, right? And last week, let's have a look at how they did last week. So if Melbourne keeps them to about 25, 26, they usually get about 45-ish. Last week, they got 57. They got 13 marks inside 50. If we had a look at Melbourne, they limited them to just 7 in each of their 2 encounters.
Yes. So the things that won it for Geelong last week are not likely to happen again this week. They're going to have to come up with probably other ways to win.
So you touched on a couple of the elements before, Sean, but let's reiterate them. Let's sort of re-encapsulate what they were. How would you go if you're Chris Scott? What would you be focusing on as sort of pathways to goal?
I think Melbourne are a really complete, well set up team. They're sort of the classic, you got to go really fast or really slow against them. We've seen them get broken down a bit by transitions that can outpace those defensive setups. Geelong are not probably the team to do that, to really sweep past them with sort of aggressive, incisive ball movement. Geelong are probably going to have to grind it up with short, controlled, uncontested footy, which Geelong are great at. That's their one wood. But they're going to have to do that while executing well enough to not concede to Melbourne's very high levels of defensive tackle pressure. So they're going to have to go slow. They're going to have to grind. It's going to have to be probably a bit ugly, like how they started against GWS last week, just retaining control, not letting Melbourne get the ball pretty much. Like, we know Geelong can do that. That's probably their best path here.
If it's a low scoring, low stoppage grind of a game, that's on Geelong's terms. And maybe even if it avoids stoppages because of Gawn, right? Stanley versus Gawn is something you want to avoid.
Yeah, and everyone at Gawn's feet.
If it's going to be a bit of a flowing game, a bit quicker, but strangely enough with more stoppages, right? So quick passages of play between the stoppages. You'd think Melbourne's got the upper hand here. I think it's going to be on paper, it could go quite either way. I'm very sure Melbourne are quite confident going in. Every Melbourne fan I've talked to is extremely confident.
As a Melbourne fan, it's illegal for you to be confident. So,
well, I'm a neutral now. So, like, for the last 3 years, it's interesting. Life of a footy journalist, or at least from my point of view, I stopped sort of going for Melbourne when we've started doing this. So it's a bit interesting watching it a bit divorced. My Melbourne fandom is really when I talk to my dad each week, because that's one of our topics of conversation.
Yeah, but we'll see how you feel in 3 weeks if the right things happen.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But it's gone pretty well for the last 3 years that we've been doing this for the ABC. Look, let's move to the second game of the round, and we're going to have less to say on this one because we did talk about the Dogs relatively extensively last week and the week before with Bontempelli. So
also, there's a lot less contrast in these two teams.
It's really a study of two of the same, isn't it?
Yeah, like we spoke about in the ABC article that their form and momentum over the years have been very differently. Bulldogs started looking like the best team in the comp until about 2/3 of the way through. Port Adelaide have been on fire since basically that point. But the Doggies midfield the last 2 weeks has been sort of back to form. So what we should see is something that really does just revolve around those midfield battles and who can get the upper hand there.
Yeah, and let's just have a quick look at that. That's scoring from we've got scoring from forward 50 marks there, and that's quite illustrative. A lot of people look at Port Adelaide. You'd think that they're heavy scorers from forward 50 marks with Dixon and Marshall, Lysette,
not bad,
etc. Yeah, they're not as amazing as some of the other teams that we've got here. So sort of 7 goals a game type territory. They're actually worse than the Dogs, which is a bit surprising, but the Dogs have this real knack of finding these forward 50 angles, right? They'll kick it to the pocket, then they'll kick it inboard. They're
for the most part, they're not bombing it to a pack and plucking it. They're finding a guy.
Norton gets them out of trouble a little, but yeah, you're right. It's more targeted use inside 50. And I think Port occasionally default to the fact that if we don't get a mark, we've got Crummers at the feet, Fantasia's back in the team. And
Dixon won't get outmarked. And we've got like Rosie and Gray and Fantasia and Motlop and whoever else who can get in amongst it.
And all their tall forwards are good beneath their knees. Like Dixon's actually quite mobile and agile for a guy who looks like he plays in AFL Cairns. Like they've got a bunch of guys that like can move. So let's have a look at we were looking at clearances before. Let's go back to clearances. Stoppage clearances.
Yeah.
There we go.
So this is a season measure.
Yeah, and the Dogs, and I think it's pretty similar in the final, so we're not going to break that down anymore.
They're both up near the top, 4th and 5th. It's their strengths.
And defensively, it actually looks the same. We're not going to show you it. We can show you it. I want to see intercept marks, scoring from intercept marks before we do anything else. Because that's the interesting one, because there's no Alex Keith this week for the Dogs. And it may seem a pretty innocuous out to those who haven't watched much of the Dogs play this year. It's actually going to be pretty big. So the Dogs do generate a bit of score, not a ton of score from intercept marks, less than Port, less than Melbourne, more than Geelong, of course. But Alex Keith is their prime interceptor.
Yep.
He's averaged
He's a big part of that.
Yeah, him and Easton Wood form that defensive attacking sort of role, right? And enable them to work on the counter.
Yeah.
No Keith just changes their structure completely. So they've brought everyone's favourite Cody Zane in. And he averages about half the number of intercept marks a game and doesn't really generate any score. So
yeah,
I think
there's going to be collective effort needed, and it's really hard to go like for like and sort of just swap guys out of their roles in a prelim final against a really good team. It's going to be a test for them.
Also, Port have the number of tools to stretch them. Gardner's not really that guy yet, and Cody, I actually think he might even be more effective up forward for them long term, but that's an aside. So let's have a look.
You can't put Shaki and Cody forward.
It's weird. Bevo runs it in different ways, and it worked for the first half of the year. But I actually think that strategically he went so strong so early. Every other team in the comp worked out the formula to beat them, and that's what brought them back to the pack, less so than injuries. I think it was such a unique zoning, high press type thing. We saw St Kilda and Port get worked out a bit like that last year. Port's diversified how they work a bit more.
Yes. Of course, there's no Georgiadis this week either, so Port are going to have one less tall, but they still have, four of them floating around there if you factor in the rucks. Yeah,
they've almost always got a resting ruck and Dixon Marshall. And they've got one other that I've totally forgotten for the time being. They'll always run one of their midfields as a dedicated forward, or usually run a Gray or a Boak as an isolated target.
Both capable marks.
Yeah. What the cool little trick is they run Dixon up high to retain possession early and then try to loop around on him, and they'll figure that Boak or Gray can outbody whoever they're on. A bit like how Richmond used Dustin Martin at times. I'll use...
Don't say striker.
And striker's the single worst term for it. It's like someone who's never watched soccer and tries to apply it to football.
Is that worse than the Dusty role?
I mean, what we call it, dual square threat. That was pretty terrible too. It's a...
And that five role, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mismatch generating
we had
midfield who is good at forward stuff.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's about creating that mismatch and creating... the Dogs don't really have their midfielders are great, but I don't think they've got a guy who can physically battle with Gray or Boak as well. And that's an aside. No. So let's have a look.
Depends on how Bontempelli's knee is, how much he's able to drop back.
And that's the fun one. If Bontempelli's injured, they can actually go super tall up forward and stretch Port's defence, but we'll get to that in a minute. Let's have a look at the defensive numbers just quickly. Now, we were talking about stoppage clearances across the year, wasn't it?
Yep.
And they're both pretty
Bulldogs
good.
And Port are the two best defensive teams against stoppages. They've both just got really good complete midfield groups. But they're hard to slip away from.
But let's loop back to forward 50 marks. And this is the fun one, right? You've got Port's quite good. The Dogs are less good. Can we have a look in the last 6 weeks? I'm hoping that that's what we're getting at.
About the same.
Yeah. So
that's not what was breaking down for the Bulldogs. It was.
What was breaking down for the Bulldogs?
They weren't necessarily controlling the stoppages, so they were conceding out of stoppages a lot.
So let's have a look at stoppages again with that filter on.
I mean, obviously some of those stoppages are resulting in marks, but yeah, so the Bulldogs
and you're completely right. Yeah. So you've got Port is the best defensive team out of stoppages in the last 6 weeks. And you've got the
by
Dogs.
A margin.
Yeah, the Dogs
have slipped back into the non-finalists and GWS in that
And a lot of the GWS thing is
they get a lot happening both ways because they have a lot of stoppages in their games.
Yeah. So
whereas with the Bulldogs, it's straight up, they got worse at defending stoppages and they got worse at scoring from them in the last few weeks of the regular season.
So I guess for Port, the key thing is if they can control the stoppage, they're 3/4 of the way there, aren't they? If they can control the flow of ball and who gets first possession.
And the speed at which it comes out if they lose it, because obviously they have that intercept marking game against rushed and predictable exits.
So, but the Dogs, you think, are going to have to get a bit funky. They've brought Martin in this week, so they're going effectively at one extra tall.
Yeah,
they're going to have
it frees up English to roam.
They're going to have to. English might be the one who drops down back because English's intercept marking is probably his biggest strength. He's not a great ruckman. He's not very. I don't think he's necessarily convincing up forward. Most teams generally throw third tall on him or their slowest tall forward. And
yeah,
I think down back he actually reads the flight okay. He's not a great decision maker with ball in hand. I don't hate him as a player.
Yeah, just keep rattling it off.
Everyone has weaknesses, right? Especially every second ruckman. I ranted a little bit about Luke Jackson,
yes,
current rising star, but he's we now.
You are the young second ruck skeptic.
Well, yeah, and you kind of have to carry these guys. We did write an article a year and a half, 2 years ago about what do you want out of second ruck? A guy who doesn't lose it more than 80% of the time and can contribute elsewhere. And I think teams get caught in the trap that maybe their second ruck needs to be more like a first ruck and they can ruck in harmony or whatever. But I think in the modern game, that doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah, but we'll see how English goes this week and what role they actually give him, because it could be any role or all of them.
I think his strongest role is that intercept marker, a bit like Max Gawn will fill for Melbourne.
There's also some merit to the idea of trying to stretch Port Adelaide's defence by playing as many mobile tools as possible.
And that's a thing, right? So if Aaliyah has to be more accountable, maybe that opens up the forward line. Maybe if they keep going with those funky entry angles to the forward 50 and scoring approaches, maybe that takes away the ability for Jonas and Co to rival.
Yeah, then you're routing around them. Because while Aaliyah has been the flashy getting the focus for these marks in the last few weeks, it's been a team effort, both the intercepting and the rebounding for Port for the last couple of years. Aaliyah has strengthened them there. He didn't create that strength.
And the other thing that we're going to say is, can you just pull up rebound 50 scores for the year on defence? And that's a great one. So the Dogs are sometimes susceptible if they can't get their zone in quick, right? So
they get rebounded out the back.
But if they can stop early enough, they can stop teams from coming out. They do have more rebound 50s because they have more inside 50s than most teams, but they are a little bit weak in setting up their zone. Luke Beveridge did tell us that earlier this year,
and they can't rely to the same extent on 1-versus-1 wins in those defensive situations as well.
A bunch of those teams right at the top of some of those forward pressing teams, the teams that do set up the wall up early, have maybe even 2 rucks, right? They'll have them playing sort of stoppage roles so they can get that re-entry game.
Absolutely.
The Dogs don't necessarily do that. Yeah. So, look, I think this is more than time. So thanks for joining us for another week. Really, really enjoy doing this with you all and our three watchers. We hope you like it. If you've got any feedback, get back to us. Thanks, Sean, for having another yarn.
No worries.
And we'll
hopefully be able to catch up in person soon.
Yeah, look, and keep watching the ABC and HBN for more content. We've got quite a few more articles left this year, and of course the draft and trade period. That
HBN footy trade and draft period.
Oh, look, sponsored by absolutely no one. But thanks for joining us again. Any comments or questions, put them in the YouTube comments or just hit us up directly. My name's been Cody Atkinson, and that's been Sean Lawson. See you later.